Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, and I'm joined by my other host,
Stu, and thank you for listening. It's a pleasure to be back, actually, recording again. I've had a bit of a back injury, and we're back from CubeCon, so excited to start content going again.
Yeah, Stu couldn't quit me, so we decided to bring him back on the show. All right, so we have an interesting episode today where we're going to discuss the erosion or evolution of Magic the Gathering in direct correlation to Cube, and how the growth of Magic as a game, now that we're at the 30-year mark, and what has changed and how that has impacted both cube curation, cube design, and for players out there trying to play your brand new cubes. But before we get into this meta-based discussion, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube. We're going to enjoy our refreshment of the show. Stu.
We are. It's called the Hazy Beer Hug, and it's by Goose Island Beer Company. It's a hazy IPA. This bad boy is 6.8%. It kicks like a mule, but it is delicious.
Yeah, it kicks like a bear because these have cute little bears on it. Cute little bears on it. I am having the Goose Island Secret Bear Hug Hazy IPA, and this is a 6.5. So we'll see how this goes, folks. Let's go and pop these bad boys open. All right, let's kick off to our topic. Stu, would you mind taking the helm here, please, sir?
Okay, so as Anthony alluded to, there's been kind of evolution in Magic. And over the years, sort of the colors have kind of shifted around a little bit. Certain abilities have kind of moved around or transitioned or have become just available in other colors, right? So part of what we wanted to talk about today is sort of the paper, rock, scissors approach. Not necessarily to cube, but sort of a magic theory in general, right? And it is the archetypes versus each other, like this trifecta, this triumvirate of archetypes, like not specific, but that just sort of
conceptual,
cover everything.
40,000 feet in the air.
Conceptual,
right,
exactly,
right.
that 40,000 feet, right? So we've got the classic aggro, right?
Yep.
Aggro, put creatures down, turn them sideways, swing. Generally tough for control to deal with aggro because you've only got a limited number of counter spells unless maybe you reach like a board sweeper or something. It's pretty easy for an aggro deck to overwhelm a control deck.
And let's go a little retro here, and let's give the listener something to envision. Think Savannah Lions turning sideways,
Exactly.
And you have counterspell in your hand.
Yep. That counterspell's great when there's something on the stack, but not so good when there's a bear that's beating you in the face every turn, even if it's just for a couple of damage. So then we have the mid-range, right? So this is a bit of a combination of things, right? If you look at a classic, like, and this is not cube, but I'll look at like a classic Jund mid-range, like a modern Jund range,
right.
Jund mid-range, right? So you've got removal, right? You've got terminate. You've got disruptive spells, Kolagon's Command. You've got Planeswalkers, Liliana of the Veil. You've got beaters in everybody's favorite, Tarmogoyf.
And I think that traditional 4/4 for 4, I would plug that in there as well, too.
Yeah.
Just that big old straight up green giant brick wall.
Yeah, but mid-range, obviously.
Think Bear Hug.
Yeah, and designed to have a suite of answers, right? As well as the creatures to be able to take you over the finish line.
Right.
And then we have control.
Aforementioned.
And there we have like the classic permission-based magic, right? So it's play a land, pass the turn. I want to prevent you from not necessarily doing anything, but certainly I want to choose my targets carefully, but I want to watch out for you, I at least have a basic understanding of what my opponent's deck does. I know what his or her power plays are.
Even a counterbounce Tipo type effect.
Yeah,
something
knowing what their power plays are, knowing what is going to put their deck over the edge. Those are the things that you're obviously going to want to deal with, and then throw in some card draw, board sweepers, so on and so forth. And actually, something that I've learned, and this is a little bit off what we originally talked about, or originally off the subject of this, was you don't actually need a win con in control. A lot of the 60-card matchups, they kind of have win cons, but then they don't have a win con.
You can just wait them out.
You just kind of win. You just kind of win because your opponent's got 4 lands and, like, no cards in hand. And you've got 6 cards in hand and 7 lands, and like I can win.
Yeah,
eventually.
But in Cube, we want them to continue playing, Stu. So we really have to want our player to continue and want to continue the match.
This is where obviously you've got a lot of differences in those 60 card constructed decks than you do like a cube deck. You're going to have, there's always going to be ways in cube for someone to win, regardless of the kind of archetype that they're driving.
Right. So the paper, rock, scissors concept is what we're talking about. And then combo is the outlier here. Or does control manage it, or is aggro managing combo?
I think if I'm playing a combo deck, the one deck archetype that I'm going to want to play the least against is certainly a control deck. Because typically with you look at something like Storm, for example, right? Combo decks tend to be a bit more glass cannon than other archetypes, and therefore you get that one or two pieces of that combo that gets cannoned or removed, whatever the case may be. It can be pretty problematic.
So what we're trying to get you to envision here is basically the framework or the shell of the cube that you're designing. And you can use that trifecta or that triumvirate, as was discussed by Stu, as a design mechanism to begin the initial balancing phase of your cube idea. Conceptually speaking, before you start laying something to paper, this is the thought process that people run through. What's going to be my aggro suite? What's going to be my control suite? What's going to be my mid-range suite? And am I going to include some form of combo or synergies that are going to either trump or fall in for the cuteness effect, if you will, right?
Yeah. So that sort of begs an interesting question as well, right? So obviously, everyone who's listened to our podcast for a while knows that, yes, I have a cube that I've been curating and designing for about 4 years now. Not really, maybe 6 months, but I've got at least 12 cards that I've added so far. And Anthony is the curator, right? So here's a bit of a question. This wasn't planned. You're someone that takes that 40,000 feet approach when you're designing a cube, right? You're looking at the color schemes. You're looking at, the theme that you want to build around, that kind of stuff, right? Do you sort of put circles in between and around and through, like those archetypes, when you're building a cube? So you want, okay, do I want aggro supporting? Because I know I've spoken to other cube curators and they've said, nah, I kind of don't want, X archetype to be included, right? So Storm is the classic from like a vintage cube perspective. But I've also talked to people who have said, I kind of want to get away from just like 5-color good stuff, which I would more put towards like a mid-range. But how do you take that approach as a cube designer where you're looking at, and I think those three are a great starting point. Obviously, you can expand from that. But I'd like to know, from your perspective, where do you start that approach of trying to fit those archetypes together? And how evenly are you trying to put a distribution together when you're building a cube?
So I'm a top-down design type of person. Yeah. So I think of an idea, and then I have to either shut my brain off or execute the idea. So, for example, I just theory crafted a chess-based cube, and it's going to be a battle chess cube. So I'll kind of explain that process.
I'm excited for that
framework. So it's going to be a black and white. So the first thing I did is came up with the conceptual idea. It's going to be black and white. Sleeves are going to be black and white. They're going to be mixed together, etc. I'm going to have knights. So I have to have something that represents rooks. I have to have something that represents control, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. Then I have to find pieces that fall into those places. So I work it kind of backwards. I come from the top of the idea, and then I move the pieces to the idea. Opposed to going, I'm opening up my binder, aggro cards. Open up my binder, controls card. I don't do that. What instead I do is, okay, I'm going to have a certain amount of knights. I already penciled it down. Chessboard's going to have this many pieces. I believe it's 32.
It is correct. It is 32.
Did I pass?
You did 8 pawns.
I know. I stared uncomfortably from over there. Yes. And then I have to have something that represents each one of those key pieces in that framework. So once I found the pieces, then I decide which archetypical 40,000 feet in the air designation that I get. Is this an aggro creature because it's low efficiency, attacks hard, attacks fast, or is it falling more into a mid-range subgrouping? And I start parsing them out that way, and that's how I start doing my initial cuts on my idea before I even put pen to paper.
So do you group them in multiple categories as well when you're designing it? So this to me, and again, I like to look at all of the podcast episodes that we do when we talk about cube. Again, I'm not a curator, but I like to learn from the people who are smart at building cubes, which is a lot of people that I know. And shout out to all the amazing conversations, again, that we had at CubeCon with all the wonderful curators over there. It was great to get that kind of perspective, because not just from someone who's looking to get into playing a cube or building a cube, but also someone who wants to develop more as when I'm drafting a cube, right? I want to be able to look for those pointers. I want to be able to sort of read things as I'm drafting, right? It's great to be able to look at a kit list on Cube Cobra and sort of kind of identify it that way. But, there's something.
So when I'm taking those pieces and I'm moving around, I'm using kind of like a development of a Venn diagram.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
I'm moving them around. And then it's also showing my cross-pollination points and my basically where areas bisect dissect into what grips, or if I've got an oversaturation of an idea, too much aggro, too much burn, and I start putting them in Venn diagram slots. But I'm not doing that. To not get that fancy, when I'm typing it out, I'm either drawing it out or I'm literally laying the cards out and standing up like a weirdo. My wife will walk in. I've got my office. My entire floor is vacated, covered in magic cards, and I'm sitting there walking around like I'm dissolving the Da Vinci Code. But she's like, "You're a dork," and she slams the door. But that's kind of what I do. That's my process. That's what I enjoy. It's super weird, but I enjoy it.
I mean, I get to do a commander deck just like I've got a large mouse pad, but that's pretty much all the space I need for only 100 cards or 60 cards.
We call it the magic room in my house, which is my wife grits her teeth as she makes that statement. But
I don't know. Have you posted? You need to put some pictures of that room on the social.
It's super clean now. Super clean. We got the in-laws coming into town tomorrow, so it doesn't look like it normally does. It doesn't look like a mad scientist lab right now. But we've digressed.
Let's talk about the colors, right? Because let's go all the way back to the history and the origins of magic. The pillars of magic.
1993.
1993.
Circa. Yes.
Back in the OG days.
So now that we've built this kind of using that basic framework of the aggro and the mid-range and the control and how they work together in correlation, the other ideas that we use, or at least what represented, we'll use our 1990, everybody put on their 1993 brains for those that were here. And
I was 14.
What each piece of the color pie at that time represented to the players. And what we've written down here is a couple of ideas. So I'm going to start with white.
There are a couple of key pieces, right? A couple of key identifiers.
They're identifiers. They're kind of the monikers get attached to these when you're playing a white deck. This is kind of the top level what a player can expect they might see within said deck, and we've become quite used to that, right? Until 2020, but we'll come back to that. All right, so let's start with white. So white as a color represents law and order and compassion.
And I would say, actually, one of the cards here that we're going to talk about, I think, just sums it up perfectly.
It does, in fact. And the associated attributes of said color white, at least circa 1993, were kind of life gain, vigilance, prevents damage, those type of ideas. And that's what the cards kind of as themselves played into. You know, he had a few interesting cards that may have had some form of first strike, which was oftentimes attached to white. Mm-hmm. But now that I go through that list, that's kind of what you came to expect with the color white, that the creature was going to have first strike, maybe, or vigilance. Or when it entered the battlefield, it's going to gain life, or the spell made you gain life, or the spell prevented damage. It was basically law and order and compassion, all in a nutshell. It was very sanguine. It was very right. And then we move over to the card that I used. In each one of these, we've represented each key piece of the color pie with this initial, I think is the card that best represents it, was Healing Salve. And for one white, you get an instant, or one plains. Choose one, target player gains 3 life, or prevent the next 3 damage that would be dealt to target creature or player this turn. If you could ever pick a card that just represented the idea of compassion and the idea of initially of white and what it represented, that would be the card. And this
chill out.
This created this.
Why are you attacking? All right, look, there's just everyone have a bit of life. All right, that thing over there that's giving me grief and aggro. Like, look, just to stop that creature. Let's talk about this.
And the next card that we've chose to represent this would be balance, which is very law and order oriented, right? And what we're trying to do here is show this is the benchmarks that when the game first came out, that, as I said, represented what this color does on its particular piece of the pie. This is what players generally came to expect.
Balance is such a wonderfully named card.
It is.
Well,
it is.
When you look at it, right?
The scales are perfect.
It really does level the playing field, right? Because everyone now has the equal amount of lands, amount of creatures, amount of cards in hand. You know, it's beautifully named, and in my opinion, maybe the most iconic white card.
And we've now placed our first pillar representing white. Stu, would you like to do the next pillar?
All right. So the next color we're going to talk about is blue. Everybody's favorite color. Not everybody's, but a lot of people's favorite color. So knowledge, methodology, understanding, right? That's what
discovery.
Discovery, exactly, right? That's what blue is about. And in the annals of magic over the years, what's a couple of cards that we can look at that the first one absolutely needs no introduction? Ancestral Recall. In my opinion, the most powerful card that's ever been
blue,
printed.
draw 3 cards.
Like, the thing that I love about Ancestral Recall Obviously, we've discussed its power level ad nauseum. I know we had this conversation at CubeCon with certain people who are like contract from below. And it's an anti-card, so we're not going to include it in this conversation. But Ancestral Recall is so agnostic. You could walk up to literally anyone. Walk up to a Yu-Gi-Oh player or a Pokemon player. Be like, hey, I know you might have never heard of Magic, but I'm going to ask you to judge this card. Tell me if you think it's a powerful card. Because at instant speed, for one resource, you get 3 cards. I would struggle to believe that anyone would be like, nah, do you really want 3 cards at instant speed, like any time that you like?
Well, not if you have 2 left in your deck.
But, hey, maybe you've got Fastest on. Or Labman, whatever. But obviously, it just really does epitomize what blue is about, right? I want more resources. I want to be able to draw cards. I want to be the permissive. I want to have control. It's an incredibly egotistical color,
it is. It's a little presumptuous.
It's incredibly presumptuous because, especially in a 4-player game, which Cube generally is not, but you're now policing what's going on, right? You're controlling the situation. And I play blue. I like playing blue, but I can certainly understand how it's kind of a frustrating color as well.
So players have come to expect. Again, we're doing this pillar idea. We're benchmarking again from 1993 brains moving forward. It equals draw, it equals counter, equals bounce, and I'll go ahead and throw in some form of flying.
Flying, absolutely. Yeah. I would associate blue. As far as the sort of the fundamental creature abilities, I think flying belongs to blue 100%.
So it represents, if I said, hey, I'm playing a blue deck, these are the things that pop into players' minds.
Yeah.
He's probably got a counterspell. He's probably doing some form of flying, or he's going to counterbalance me.
Correct.
And it's just an expectation that has become attached to the idea of our second pillar, which is blue, which we're moving on to now our third pillar, which is going to be black. And it's going to be based around pride and ambition, greatness at any cost. It's going to be life loss, sure.
You only need 1 HP to win.
You only need 1 HP to win. It literally sticks with that whole, you only need, as long as there's 0 and you're 1, you win the game. That's very black in its central idea of the piece of the pie.
Yep.
And then sacrifice. It doesn't matter. I'm willing to give up and trade off my creature to get yours. It has no problem with that. And the card that we've chosen to represent that best is going to be Dark Ritual. And for 1 swamp, you actually get an instant that adds 3 black to your mana pool. This is very powerful as well. We're using this as the benchmark pillar of this particular set, which pairs so nicely with this next card, which is truly disgusting, is Pestilence. And I thought Pestilence was just another great card. I realized there's a lot of Pauper Cubes out there still running this, by the way. You really shouldn't be running this, but I'm just going to... I realized...
when you first mentioned that, I was like, really? Because it's a powerful card, but like, can one card like that be so problematic? Because obviously you got to get...
Yes, it can.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it can. Yes, it can.
Oh, yeah. It's absolutely disgusting.
See our Pauper episode for discussion on Pestilence. Yes. But I thought that these 2 cards best represented the idea of what you can expect as a Magic player or a cube curator or a cube designer of what the color black as it encompasses. This is what you can expect of that piece of the pie.
I like that you've chosen these cards over some cards that I think might be a little bit more obvious, right? So something like Demonic Tutor might be a little bit more obvious.
Sure.
Something like Dark Confidant might be a little more obvious.
Yeah, I didn't want it to be on the nose.
Yeah, like those are power outliers as well, right?
Plus, these are in 1993. This is what set the tone of how we as curators, the belief system, what we've had we've been indoctrinated in this idea. This is what you expect this color to do.
Yes.
So what I'm doing is we've now built our third pillar. Let's move over to our fourth pillar. Stu, would you mind taking it away?
Our fourth pillar is red. Maybe red's the best, not blue.
It's my favorite.
It's red.
It's my favorite. I love it.
So what is red? It's passion.
It is.
It's impulse. It's aggression.
It's my amor. Let the music take...
Red is such a... I love red, right? Anyone that knows that has played with me, regardless of the format, knows how much I love red, right? I'm very format agnostic when it comes to the colors that I like, and red is like red may be my baby above all others, right? Maybe white, but I do like blue, and black is awesome as well. And maybe
you pretty much like all the colors. You just like Wooburg. Just give it up.
I do. But red is what is red? What do you think of when you
Haste,
think of red? Right,
burn,
Haste,
fire,
burn.
rummaging, like
Immediately
looting.
I think of burn. Right, that's
Yeah.
the first thing I
Burn,
think
burn,
of because
burn.
I think the most iconic card for red for me is lightning bolt.
It is. It
I
is.
think
in fact.
red would be the one card that I would think of. Anyone said like name the first red card that comes into
Lightning
your brain.
bolt.
I'm thinking of lightning bolt. Right,
Yep.
rummaging. Right, looting, faithless looting, cards like that. Right. Those are the kind of card, like the kind of flavors.
Exile, because it embraces the chaos.
Exile when
It's very chaotic. This color is going to be impulsive, aggressive, passionate, and so that benchmarks when I say, "Hey, Anthony's playing a red deck."
Yeah.
This is what you expect. And I don't care. This cross pollinates into EDH Commander, etc.
It does, and I kind of feel that
Before 2020, keep going.
I kind of feel that this is the one color that when I'm playing it, right. And again, I'm coming at this from a player's perspective rather than a curator's perspective. But this is my expectation when I play red. Certainly a mono red, but even if I'm playing red and splashing other colors, I am going to go more all out when I'm playing red than any other color. I'm dumping literally everything I can.
Yeah.
Like there's no holding back.
Yeah.
I almost feel like I'm being like I'm cheating on red.
I would go so far as to say that red can, and people may disagree with this, especially for the exile portion and the discard expectations that red often has, as, from a play perspective.
Yep.
It can be the one that's the most difficult to grasp and learn. It's an advanced idea. And when we did our Art of the Discard episode, we specifically talked about that it's a skill that comes with time.
Red is a hard
color
to play.
Red is hard to play.
It's a hard color to play because you've got to know, because generally the resources are very flexible in red, and understanding where your targets are, what cards to discard. Do you discard that land, or do you have that, that extra 2 damage somewhere, or maybe I need to get rid of that creature, but I really want to burn face right now. So a lot of trees in the decision making.
Yeah, so red has now covered our 4th pillar and what we expect as Magic players. Whenever we say I'm playing a red deck, you have preordained notions you can expect. Even if you see a red deck in Cube, you know kind of what you should expect out of that deck. Let's move on to the next one, which is going to be green, and it's going to be nature and tradition. It's basically going to hold up the old ways. That's the 40,000 feet, the holistic idea of what green represents as a color, at least in 1993 moving forward. And it's going to represent your growth and your stompy decks and your ramp, and your hexproof will even be kind of a non-traditional that got attached to it later. And it started adopting Death Touch at a certain point. And that's more of a nature poison attribute, not so much as poison keyword, but rather it's just what nature does.
Yep.
And that's how they really built that. So you got a card that represents that, and it represents it so well, and it's back to our first pillar marker, and it's going to be giant growth. And for 1 forest, you get an instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 until the end of the turn. It just makes things bigger. It's nature-oriented.
That's right.
And then the next we're going to use to represent this is regrowth. What else could speak nature and the idea of tradition better than regrowth? It's going to be for 1 colorless and 1 green. You get a sorcery. Return any card from your graveyard to your hand. What we use these is to benchmark the idea. So if you're saying, hey, Stu's playing a green deck. He's got Leatherback Beowulf in that deck.
And Colonial Tusker.
Dang
straight.
Damn straight. That's a shout out to JP. See how many times I get an episode.
Shout out, JP. He knows that I like to. I'm going to be throwing in that Leatherback Beowulf suggestion and mention at every opportunity. So yeah, thank you. Hey, it's a 4/5 for 3 mana. Okay,
it's not bad. It's not bad on rate. But what we're trying to do now is we've done this top level. So let's walk back through this again. We kind of talked about the paper, rock, scissors and how that is a curation point, a starting point.
Yeah.
Where if you want to use it, we realize it's imperfect. It's got fallacies to it. We acknowledge that. But you can start framing the idea of
you have to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. You got nothing. Or you're just being a red player and it's chaotic development. Exactly. And then the next one is you kind of, when you start benchmarking, you're looking for your colors based on attributes that you've associated as a Magic player. Us being started, I started in 96. Stu started way later in his career. But I developed my ideas of how Magic cards play based on the sets of the time. And that would have been Tempest and Exodus and 5th edition and 4th edition, etc. And
you know what's crazy about that point as well is you started playing so long before I did, right?
And you're still better.
That's not true. But when you look at the sort of the scope and how Magic has progressed and developed over the last few years, it's crazy that even myself, and I consider myself still quite a new player, right? Born of the Gods, it's a few years ago now, but not compared to someone like yourself who's been playing since that long ago. And yet when you look at the cards that were considered super powerful, right? Maybe not vintage power, but, card like Questing Beast back then, I would have absolutely lost my mind about seeing a card like that printed back then.
Came out in Eldraine.
Yeah. Came out very recently, right? It just goes to show where the cards are now compared to where they were 3 or 4 years
and
ago.
before we
when
even
you look at a card like Questing Beast.
This has been a secret, like a secret card episode, and we're going to talk about Questing Beast. But before we even step into that, we basically set the stage of the expectations of the color wheel and the framework you use for design.
So now ask the question.
And now, the only time, I had someone add a piece of information today that was interesting.
Okay, perfect.
Got some new input. And it was an interesting concept. So aside from what we expect the colors to do, the one exception that we have always made as Magic players is that we allowed the plane at which you were in at the time to also define and bend the rules because it made sense. Like, for example, if you went to Zendikar, it was okay, you had waste. And people accepted it, and no one got mad. It didn't cause a complete revolt of the idea when you start introducing a colorless mana form because it just made sense.
Okay.
So the storytelling, the world development that Wizards of the Coast did such a great job of at the time, it allowed to set the stage that it didn't break my brain. Almost at the time, I used to be this Magic purist where I thought the pie pieces were not to be touched, right? So to the point that I was making is, aside from that fundamental idea of which each piece of the pie represented, for me as a curator and as a Magic player, an enfranchised Magic player, I did allow the storytelling to change the rules, if you will, right? Like, instead, I kind of accepted it because I do appreciate the idea of world building. But as a fundamental, as in the pillars of Magic and what I expect, when I say you're playing a green deck or you're playing a red deck, I have expectations as to what I should, Anthony is going to see in said deck. And then we move on to the creature that you alluded to a moment ago, Questing Beast, which is going to knock this out of the park.
Yes.
Stu, would you mind explaining to the audience what Questing Beast does?
All right, so Questing Beast, 2 colorless, 2 green, legendary creature, beast. It has... it's just word soup. Let's just get that out there, right? It's insane how much this has for 4 mana. Vigilance, Death Touch, Haste, 4/4. 4/4 for 4 is already like, okay. Oh, it has Vigilance and Death Touch and Haste. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Any combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented. And when Questing Beast deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target Planeswalker that player controls. The amount of just stuff that this card does, let's just ignore the fact that it's got all these little crossover abilities, right? That we'll get to
cover,
But just the amount that this card does is just bananas. And actually, in one of our...
Thank God it's legendary. Right?
We actually covered this card specifically in an episode we did recently with Justin Parnell, where I brought this card up as like, maybe this is one of the creatures, if not the creatures, the linchpin for holding the torch for mono green aggro.
It is,
because it's maybe the best piece of top end aggro that it's had. Like the fact that it can't be blocked by 2 or less, the fact that your creature combat can't be prevented, the fact that it does deal that excess damage to planeswalkers, it's super, super powerful.
So let's break this down using the 5 pillars of Magic that Anthony defined for you. We broke down each one of those colors and what we had an expectation, and we're going to take Questing Beast and let's dissect it amongst ourselves. Let's dissect.
Get your scalpel.
Right. So first off, we're going to talk about it has Vigilance. Okay. And as we declared before, that was a very white piece of the pie.
Not very green, is it?
It's not a very green attribute.
It's not trample.
It's not right.
It's not hexproof.
Correct. It's not. It's a very white attribute. So it just crossed over into that subsection of the pie. Correct. And then the next we're going to have is Death Touch. Now, I do realize that is a green because it's very naturistic, but it also kind of slightly crosses over into Black's territory, ever so slightly, because green and black, Golgari tend to share this idea. So I did want to benchmark that it's a little green, a little black, but I'd say mostly green because it is very nature-oriented.
Yes.
Here's where it gets super weird, though. It goes into Red's territory. And
not unprecedented.
It has happened. It has happened.
Right? But it just seems odd. on this creature. I'm not going to lie. It seems
It's a
little
sports
odd
car.
to
This
have
car
it.
is literally a sports car.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it has haste, which is a red attribute, cutting into that red piece of the curation pie.
Yeah.
The next one is it's the on rate. It's the very green thing. It's the 4/4 for 4 mana. It's on rate Stompy. I mean, it's the Leatherback Baelos of the world. I know they're a little.
Leatherback Baeloth was a 4/5.
It was that was a bad example, but you know where I'm going. It's just green and get you there.
But yeah, it is
Very mid-rangey.
I think you couldn't make this a 5/5 for 4 with all those abilities, right?
No, that'd be disgusting.
But here's a great question.
Be ultra legendary.
Considering it's at the top end, right?
Yeah.
I would put this fairly close to the top end. If I'm playing, let's say, for example, an aggro deck in a fairly high-powered cube, I think this is kind of going to want to be towards the top end.
Yeah.
Right? Could you play this if it was a 3/3?
Yeah.
Could you?
No, but 4/4 allows it to survive bolt. That's the guiding principle here.
It does.
That's the litmus test that I'm going to use.
I don't disagree. I don't think it would be unplayable as a 3/3.
It would definitely be playable.
But to me, that's kind of how on the precipice a lot of cards like this can be, right? And especially if I'm thinking about
if this was a 3/4, this would be still
if it was
very
a 3/4,
viable,
it would
very
be very
viable and powerful card.
If it was a 3/3, I'm certainly not saying that it's unplayable.
It starts
or
moving
it
out
would
of
be a
power.
bad
It starts
card.
moving out of the highest powered vintage cubes at that point.
Exactly.
That
Even
designation.
any cube.
So that's a
cube
very
you want to talk
green kind of idea. That's that tradition.
Exactly.
That's what they do, is that trade-off. The next one is kind of another piece, so let's break this one down. It was the can't be blocked by creatures 2 or less. That's mostly a green idea, but that kind of gets over to that.
green.
But that starts cutting into that little bit of that blue evasion. And a blue's the only one that's not going to... I'm really reaching for blue here, because blue I'm going to kind of define as the flying color, and I know white goes into that too. But evasion is something that white and blue like to do. Green traditionally uses trample as a form of evasion, whereas Questing Beast now has evasion based on power and toughness. This is still a green thing because it's overwhelming it. It's stomping it. So we're going to call this a green attribute.
I mean, it's basically...
It's on the cusp.
Would you argue that it's basically trample?
It is scramble. It is scramble. It's scramble.
Right? But it's only for scramble of creatures with 3 power or toughness, because 2 power can't block them.
Correct. But let's get into the next weird piece of it. It's the prevents all damage.
That's pretty nuts.
That is a very red attribute. That's the anti-fog. That's
You think so?
It is. Players can't prevent damage. I mean, literally every old school magic
pure
burn
red?
spell.
Are you saying it's
That's
pure
a pure
red?
red idea, as in damage can't be prevented. Is a very red attribute. We've cut into red's pillar now.
I suppose specifically damage can't be prevented, yes.
Yes.
I feel like the other abilities are so soupy as far as, but yeah.
It's becoming, this is a very
100%.
muddled mixture, but what I want to do is take these out. So what I'm doing is I'm putting pins on the pillars of the magic components that this singular card is touching. Just, we're dissecting this one card and by its design.
Yeah.
Even though it's legendary, it's getting away with literally breaking every piece of the pie.
Correct.
Even outside of it's not using the planar idea that I interjected before. It's just a storytelling. It's a fantastic thing, but what does it have to do with fairy tales except for it's a questing beast? It's OP and it's just breaking the color pie.
I mean, the name is cool.
It is very cool.
The art is super
The next
awesome.
piece of it is it's excess damage to planeswalkers. That's also a very red rolling thunder type of overwhelming. That kind of goes into trample a little bit, more scrample. Where
Exactly.
It's getting reachy. So now we've got a card that's mostly touched into white. It's broken to green spectrum, blacks, and reds. Yeah, so we're not going to let it really get into blue. I'm being a little reachy there. But you see with this card, this is one design that's now breaking the entire color pie, the spectrum that we talked about in the framework.
What it should
And now
have,
where do you put this card in your cube curation development?
Well, look, what it should have, this was a design mistake. What it should have had, it should have also had flash, and when it enters the battlefield, counter
That would have
target
been
instant
blue.
or sorcery spell,
Yeah,
and then
very
it would literally just be all of the colors.
It's just interesting how this mono green creature has so many attributes associated to the spectrum of the color pie. And this is how it basically starting to blow away. It's blinding out that pillars that we talked about. And then you have to ask yourself, and this is more of a magic meta question, is this evolution of the game?
Inevitable.
Or is this erosion of the game as Dr. Richard Garfield designed?
It's a bit of both, right? Because there's, I don't know, I almost feel a little dirty for saying this, but there's only so much design space.
Correct. We just
right?
hit 30 years.
We did.
It's running
right?
out.
There's also you're only ever limited by your own imagination, right? So all the people at Wizards of the Coast, all the designers out there, they're only limited by one thing, really, and that is their own imagination. But not really, because do Magic players, and maybe this is so meta, it's like way outside the scope of just Cube, but how concerned are Magic players, Cube curators, anyone that's involved with the game? Is it ever a concern? Has it been? Will it be that either the just amount of stuff that Magic has gets too much?
Oh yeah, the saturation rate,
right?
there.
The saturation
but
of
you
abilities.
do have we're going off on tangent 50 as we do here at UberCube. But it's a good point because you do have the ability, and I have been doing it personally, where there's a new set that just came out, and this is a tangent, but this is relevant to what he's asking, is this new the Brothers War is just now coming out.
Correct.
And I have an artifact cube. Mm-hmm. And we just came back from CubeCon, and I received some very great intel and feedback from all the different players out there that told me this card's too powerful, this one's not strong enough, etc. But what I didn't get from them is you need to rebuild this entire cube. Brothers War is literally screaming, I could technically build a cube from Brothers War. But as a curator, I'm going to make, it's a 360 cube. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's probably about 6. There's 3 cards that are definitely bad. 6 that can get updated, and maybe 9 if I just want to get some fresh and variety. But as a curator, you do have the option to not buy into the new squeaky toy, the new shiny thing every time Wizards of the Coast prints it. I've started becoming more responsible in my curation. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. Is not a bad methodology because I don't want to unbalance. Because you can't unbalance a cube.
There's been a few on the watch list in that cube, right? And I think any curator will have, kind of an idea like, yeah, maybe there's a couple of cards in this cube that I need to keep an eye on. And if I notice that next time it gets played that there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 cards kind of get a bit out of hand, then sure, okay, I can appreciate that I need to cut them. But you're right. And I talked to pro players that were like, you know what? I kind of feel like this is an avenue I could go down and this is how I would draft the cube. But it wasn't like, man, this cube sucks, or, it's so obvious that you need to draft this color or this archetype. So I think that's a good
So just because Magic is breaking outside of the color pie expectations, even outside of the normal planar idea of what we would excuse as Magic players, it's okay that you basically time vault or lock your cube, or you don't have to let everything in. You don't have to keep up with the Joneses, is what I'm saying as a curator. Because for one thing, I can't afford to manage that level of purchasing foils every month. But you get where I'm going with this.
There's your secret right there. Stop foiling out
your cubes. So it's going back to the questing beast. Is interesting. I've read a lot of forums, stuff like that. A growing number of curators have actually removed this creature just based on its power level. And then I got to ask Stu, do you think this card's too powerful for cubes? Because I do not.
No.
I think it's a perfectly serviceable card.
Yeah.
I think it just does everything I want it to do as a curator. I think it's interesting. It keeps people on their toes. And it kind of checks all those boxes back to that, what we were saying before with this paper, rock, scissors. This creature kind of does all of those things, and it breaks the color pie.
Yes.
It's such an interesting design.
It's a great design.
It's frightening that it's so great, because now that breaks my brain on the curation that I was using with the Venn diagrams. Questing Beast, where do I put this? Right in the middle of the diagram?
Even though it's word soup, even though it has haste, vigilance, death touch, even though it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, even though it prevents combat damage from your creatures being prevented, this is how crazy it is. Years ago, I'd have looked at that card, I'd be like, this might be the most broken card I've ever seen. Now I look at it and I'm like, this looks very balanced.
I think it's amazing. I think it's very balanced.
I think it's an incredibly balanced card.
Because I think we've evolved as players as the game has as well.
Have we evolved, or have we just been brutalized by power creep to be like looking at a card with like 4,000 words on it and being like, yep, you know what, for 4 mana, that is perfectly fine.
Or we're just accepting at this point. So let's move over to another card that I'm going to ask Stu to read. That's really a new one that's been introduced that kind of breaks this wheel concept as well.
So I like that you've asked me to read this card because I drafted it in our Dominaria United draft. And yeah, for the first time, Blue got some game. And this card that we're going to talk about is called the Phasing of Jalfir. It is a saga, which is an enchantment. And it's got this read ahead thing, which I think is pretty cool. So for anyone who's not familiar, with the sagas before, right? You start in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. But these have read ahead.
Which I think is so neat and flavorful.
That's incredible. You can just start on anything that you like, right? You can start on chapter 1 or chapter 2 or chapter 3. Here's the thing. Chapter 3, Blue gets a board sweeper.
Yeah, which is
For
interesting.
4 mana.
Not a bounce, not a mass bounce, not an evacuation.
No, it's literally destroy all creatures. Now, for all creatures destroyed this way, its controller creates a 2/2 black Phyrexian creature token, and the chapters 1 and 2 are another target non-land permanent phases out. It can't phase in for as long as you control the phasing of Zalfir. So I can actually, I can see like that. There's some fun stuff you can do with that.
It's just so interesting that so with the word destroy, we've kind of stepped into, and granted, we've had stuff like rapid hybridization and all that. I do realize the word destroy has existed on blue cards,
Right?
But we've kind of stepped into
Not a sweeper though.
We've kind of mass destruction is a little different, not
destruction.
mass bounce.
Not just
so we've
one.
kind of stepped into the white and the black kind of, and we'll give a little bit of red.
Would you say
mass.
that this is fundamentally? I would say this is fundamentally white because of Wrath of God.
I would 100% say,
Right.
minus
And
the
yes,
can't be regenerated. Instead, you give them a bunch of Phyrexians.
Exactly.
But it is definitely it's stepping over to another piece of the pie, which is showing how this game is really starting to over time. Now that we're at 30 years, that pie, these pillars that we've been talking about, they're slightly starting to erode. And then what I am as a curator realizing that that's not necessarily a bad thing right now. It's innovation.
Gives you choices.
You have to have choices. And what we say is you can time vault. You can lock your cube. If you're not happy with it, you do an old border cube, and you don't want blue to ever have access to mass destruction,
Which it now has.
of creatures, which it now has. And granted, this is not the best cube card in the world, but it's just a little taste. It's just a little
You don't
taste
think?
on that charcuterie board of what's coming in 2024 of how cards are now being developed by Magic or Wizards of the Coast that are now rolling out that are starting to really deviate from that Dr. Richard Garfield exceptionally balanced,
pillars.
beautifully orchestrated pillars that we
Yes.
know as the
The
color
lines
pie.
are blurred
They're becoming super blurred.
and becoming more so blurred. And this one is a great example, right? One of the reasons why I like the fact that we use this as an example of these shifts is because, honestly, I don't really think blue needed a whole lot of help.
No, blue is definitely bleeding out.
But this card is... How playable do you think this card is? Like you say, is this a great cube card?
It is in a vacuum within certain cube curations where people might have an environment that fosters this idea. I don't particularly have, out of my 6, a cube that would run this. But what I want to do is benchmark this as the idea of now, well, blue's got wraths. It's something,
Exactly.
It's the new thing. It's not the questing beast anymore that has haste and vigilance and death touch and all this nonsense. Now we've got the color pie, literally everything now. That Venn diagram is becoming a circle now, and everything's just starting to fill in as a giant
What I'm
block.
hoping is that there's not this precedent that we're now getting set. Like you say, it's 2022, right? This is not a new thing necessarily that cards are crossing out of their own color identity and getting these abilities that you would associate with other colors. And maybe this is just a personal hope of mine that I don't want this to be like, hey, we just kind of want you to get used to this exists, and then there's going to be an acceleration of it down the line, right? Because I don't want it to be like 2 years' time, there's 4 sweepers in blue for 4 mana.
I mean, we've
created
created at this point, and I don't dislike any of these. I had that same level of not acceptance of, say, the Secret Lairs when they first came out, The Walking Dead, but or excuse me, I was the one that actually bought them, and everybody else in my group got really upset because they're like, I had Rick, and I'm playing Rick, and
I killed Daryl on site.
It was
we have a rule in our group that whenever Daryl comes out, he gets killed on sight.
But I'm a person too that's like I guess innovation is part of a game, else it'll become stagnant, right?
I agree. I don't think it needs to be, but I would.
Restriction breeds creativity.
Yeah.
Their form of restriction is more like Venturi effect, where they're being bottlenecked and they have nowhere else to go. I mean, 30 years, the game is not writing itself, right? They have to keep the Wizard of the Coast has to keep developing new schemes, new ideas to keep it fresh and popping to beat all these other trading card games.
Yeah.
In order for them to stay relevant and even beat, stay where we're buying cardboard for this expensive price that we pay as curators to keep us appeased, we need to keep getting more product.
And I think that's
it's kind of a hard game to balance.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, right? Is I like that we have this balance, right? I like that we have this separation between the colors, right? And for me, if I'm sitting down and playing a cube, I like the fact that I see that separation. I don't mind that there's blurs there. I don't mind that there's cards like
Some
Questing
blurs.
Beast. Some blurs. I
yeah.
don't mind Questing Beast. I even don't mind the phasing of Zalfir. I don't think it's a particularly great card. it fits so thematically with how the game has progressed with these kinds of cards that have crossed over. There's going to be a drawback, right? Exactly how much of a drawback that it is, who knows? But where is this going to lead to cube design, right? And where does sort of that end?
I think either we evolve or we just time vault our cubes. We have to lock them down. I mean, for me,
time vaulted your cube?
No, for me, I'm moving forward. I'm just
so we're going to move forward. Then,
I'm going to march forward and see what happens. Power creep is real. I mean, the game seeks to evolve. It's going to go past the franchise players because the idea is to garner new attention from new players.
Sure.
I mean, there's a point where we're not the peak audience any longer. That's the reality that Anthony Uberbear has accepted. Well, this has been a fun and very meta conversation.
It is very meta.
We wanted to be very philosophical in the idea of the benchmarks of what we've come to know as Magic the Gathering and Cube within our play group, and how the color pie defined each attribute that we expected, right? And how that is becoming eroded by innovation. But innovation's not a bad thing. It has to happen. And then we talked about how the framework of using the paper, rock, scissors approach, although it does have fallacies, is a great way of framing or developing the basic ideas of the Venn chart before you start filling in the pieces with the color pie. And you now have yourself a cube that's starting to be, it's a skeleton of a cube.
Yeah.
Right. And now that the colors are bleeding, right?
Yeah.
It's going to make it a little harder to do the Venn chart method, but you know what? We will evolve, or you can choose not to put those cards in your cube.
And maybe it just starts to make it a little easier if you're looking to cross-pollinate
It
those
makes card
colors.
evaluation more difficult. That I will say as a closing remark.
That's interesting to me, because, and that's another point that I wanted to bring up. And again, I asked these questions of you: is have you noticed examples of that where you're thinking, man, I want to sort of link these colors and a couple of these archetypes, and hey, there's these cards out there that have crossed over into these, breakages of their identity, but hey, I'm looking for a card that might sort of match in and allow me to sort of blend a couple of colors and a couple of archetypes together, and now I'm getting them organically rather than having to force everything around the archetypes.
Yeah, and we and it's, again, tangent number 437 here at UberCube.
We got to do it.
But that, even like in a tribal concept, that's to bridge those different ideas together. I have to find cards that bleed over. Like maybe it's a zombie and a vampire
or a
human
or whatever,
that crosses over and has attributes that these two different tribes would like. It's kind of the same concept.
Of course.
You're looking for bridges in that. So using the Venn diagram as your idea, you need to have points where they bisect, or you've got crossover or cross-pollination points for your different ideas. You don't want everything to be a separate entity.
No.
Right? It's separate constructed deck. You want cards to cross-pollinate.
Yeah, you don't want anyone to just pick up your cube and be like, right, if it's a 360 and everyone's going to sort of pick that lane, and you're gonna get the same 8 decks every time.
Draft on rails, right?
Precisely.
So color bleed over is inevitable with this game. Other than that, this has been a really fun meta conversation. We've had a great time. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. We just wanted to benchmark a few things. We really focused on Poor Questing Beast.
So, as always, thank you to all of our listeners. If you enjoy the show, we would really appreciate a 5-star review on your favorite player. Drop a comment, really goes a long way to getting us the exposure out there, getting us in the ears of all of the Magic and the Cube community. You can find us at Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. You reach out to us via email. We always love to check questions out, and we'll respond to anyone that reaches out. You can find us UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com. And check out the Discord, man. We've had some great conversation going there recently about CubeCon and about cubes and card choices.
And card choices.
All that kind of fun stuff as well. And we also do have a Patreon. Anthony, would you like to tell us about the Patreon?
Yeah, so we've got a cool little Patreon you can check out. It'll help us keep the show alive and well, and it has some some interaction points that you can check out. We just ask that you take a peek at it, see what you think, and we're always looking for your feedback, and we truly appreciate everything that's happening right now. Yeah. So thank you to our listeners, and thank you to our fans. And other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is Happy Cubing!